For an average hobbyist like myself, it is important to learn how to get good soldered joints. There are three types I use the most. The first one is wire to wire. I start by stripping the wires back pretty far. Then I'll cross them over in an X and twist one wire around the other. And do the same with the other side. It should look something like this. Anytime you solder, the trick is to heat up the joint enough to melt the solder. You shouldn't touch the solder to the soldering iron to get it to melt. However, sometimes adding a little blob of solder to the tip of the iron can get things to start. As you see now, the solder is flowing into the wires, but I'm not melting it with the soldering iron. This stuff is called sticky tack or poster tack. It's used to put posters on the wall, but it works great to keep your parts from moving around while you're soldering. The next solder joint that I use a lot is soldering wires to pads. I'll heat up the pad with the iron and melt a little blob of solder onto it. I do this to each pad that needs a wire soldered to it. I'll use another bit of poster tack to hold some wires down so that I can tin the ends. Sorry about the focus here. My camera setup isn't great for these short distances. For this type of joint, I strip the wires to about the length of the pad I'm connecting them to and heat them up from underneath and let the solder melt or wick into the wires. This is called tinning. Then all I need to do is melt the blob on the pad with the iron and push the tinned wire into place. The melted blob will melt the solder on the wire and make a good connection. However, if it doesn't melt all the way, you can just remelt it and reflow the solder like this. The last type of solder joint I use a lot is soldering components to boards. This is a socket rail, but will work the same with most things you want to solder to a board. I like to use poster tack to hold the component to the board, making sure it's straight and well seated, and then I can solder without worrying about anything moving around. When soldering components to pads, you need to get both the pad and the post hot enough to melt the solder, because, as I've mentioned, you shouldn't melt the solder with the iron. When the joint is hot enough, the solder will wick right onto the joint and make a nice little cone holding the post very solidly. I do suggest that if you haven't done a lot of soldering, you just practice a little bit before tackling your project. I'm going to show this again and see if I can get a better, closer angle with the camera and maybe a little better focused. And this time I'm going to use some poster tack to hold the board down to my table so it doesn't move around quite as much. The equipment I'm using here isn't fancy, but it is an adjustable solder station. I like to be able to control the temperature of my iron, but it's not critical. And you can get away with a $20 to $30 soldering iron and some solder designed for electronics if you're just a hobbyist. Well, that's about it for simple soldering. It's not too hard to do. It just takes a little practice.